And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Kelly Roman's our guest, Kelly, Park Ranger at Fort Stanwix. Kelly, before I get to the flags, when you look at the fort right next to the fencing, that's not the right word, but what's the right word?
Pickets?
The pickets there?
Yeah.
There's an indentation in the ground.
Yes, sir.
Was that ever flooded? Was that ever like a moat or?
Well, one of the tenets of an 18th century fort is you build with what you're given. So our fort is built out of earth and logs, where some forts were built with bricks and some were built with stone. And when you're near the coast and you have stone, that's a little bit more common, that area would be a moat. Now, where we are, we also have a river and a floodplain. So if you purposefully put water in there, it starts to eat away at the walls of the fort. So it was never purposefully flooded. I can imagine that on occasion it would be very damp down there and squishy because you're only a few feet over the water table. And I can also imagine that when it's very hot and dusty out, because people actually lived in that ditch, it could be very dusty and dry. But it's almost a trick of the mind or an illusion, because the fort isn't, the ditch isn't necessarily dug into the ground. The area around it is built up by removing that. So it's not as deep as it looks. When you look at it from the rest of the area, it almost is that deep, but not quite. So when you can, as I said, when you compare it to from the outside area, it was made to be that deep.
And you said people actually lived in that.
Yes, it was used as overflow housing for soldiers. So you only have so much room inside the fort. If you have more people, they can live in that ditch, still within the pickets, and be safe. And also many of the families of the soldiers had nowhere else to go, so they followed these armies. They were known as camp followers, and they lived in that ditch as well.
The soldiers at Fort Stanwix, those were all regular Army?
Yes, Continental Army. Occasionally the militia would come through to help with things. So before the siege of 1777, much of the militia was dispatched to the Wood Creek area to cut down trees and hinder British progress towards the fort. However, it was a Continental fort. It was a regular Army fort. And
the numbers that we're talking about in terms of men and women, we're talking a total of how many?
On average, about 500 men, both soldiers and officers combined. At sometimes it was lower, at sometimes it was a little higher, so its lowest probably would have been around 1781 before it was abandoned, and there's probably only about 200 folks stationed there. And its peak would have been in about 1777 in the middle of that siege, when there were about 800 soldiers jammed inside the walls. And as far as families are concerned, we unfortunately do not have a complete total. It's one of those things that has been lost to history. We know they kept records. However, they might have been burnt in the Albany archive fires. They might still be in people's private collections, passed down through the generations. So if you're holding some kind of document that says, this is how many women were at the fort, here's their names, here's where they came from, send that our way. We'd love to make a copy. We just unfortunately don't know quite how many.
Hard to believe 800 people could fit inside that fort.
It's astonishing. It still blows my mind. We have days where there's 500 people in there at once for special ceremonies.
And they're
events.
standing up.
And they're standing up. And we have extra buildings, so if they needed to go inside, they could be in there. But when the fort was there and there were 800 soldiers, there weren't as many buildings as there were in the completed version of the fort that we represent. And I have no clue where they jammed themselves.
I would say, you tell me if I'm off here, that 99.9% of Fort Stanwix is reconstructed, but there is a little bit of the original fort there, yes?
There is an original piece of the fort that's still on display, aside from the artifacts that you can see in the visitor center. So there is a fireplace hearth that is normally on display in the northern area of the fort. And that was the one that was in the best condition when the archaeological excavations took place in the 70s. So that was the one that was left on display for people to come and look at and reflect what had happened during the revolution there. This day, and for the next year, I'm thinking maybe two from what I've understood, there is historic preservation work being done on the fort, which means the walls of the fort are being rebuilt with techniques of the day. And to keep that fireplace hearth safe, it's been covered over, so it's kind of locked off in its own little area, and you can't view it up close. But keep track of the historic preservation work, keep track of all the other things going on, and you should be able to come see it again in a year or so.
Talk about things that have been lost to history. Has it been lost to history? What flags flew over Fort Stanwix?
Unfortunately, it has been. For the longest time, and by longest I mean at least a century or two, it was believed that the original Stars and Stripes flew over the walls of Fort Stanwix during that siege of 1777. More modern research has pointed to the fact that that story was totally fabricated. So we do know a flag flew over the walls of Fort Stanwix during the siege. And we do know that it was made of red, white, and blue stripes. We have that from several accounts. However, we are not quite sure what the arrangement of those stripes would have been. So it could have been our modern flag. However, the flag resolution was to make that a naval ensign. So maybe, could have been what's called the Grand Union flag, which is essentially a British flag, a canton in the corner, and then the 13 red and white stripes to represent the colonies. It could have also been a completely different arrangement. We have one that we fly quite regularly that was passed along to us by a descendant of one of the soldiers at the fort, that's just alternating red, white, and blue stripes. And to make matters even more confusing, Peter Gansevoort's granddaughter, when people were celebrating the centennial of the United States, claimed that it was the New York State flag. And she had a version of that flag that had belonged to her grandfather at some point during the Revolution that she donated to the Albany Archives. So I don't know what flag it is. Someone out there does, but they're not talking to us because they've been long gone.
30 seconds left, Kelly. Give the date and the time for the programs.
Mysteries, Myths, and Mayhem, October 27th, Saturday evening, free of charge. Come on down. And I believe November 24th, the Saturday after Thanksgiving, the holiday open house, also free of charge. Come on down. We'd be happy to have you. And please play on our grass.
All right, we'll see you soon. That's it for us this week. We'll be back next week. We'll do it all again. Take care of yourself, everybody.